A little boy sells his only toy car at a flea market to buy medicine for his sick mom, only for a billionaire CEO passing by to notice him. What he does next leaves the boy and his mom in complete shock. Before we begin, let us know in the comments where you're watching us from, and please like this video to support the channel. Now sit back, relax, and enjoy the story. Owen held the small, chipped toy car in his hands, running his thumb over its once bright red paint, now faded from years of love and adventure. It had been his favorite for as long as he could remember, a gift from his mom on his 4th birthday. Back then, she had been healthy, her laughter filling their tiny apartment like sunlight spilling through the curtains. But things had changed. Now, her laughter was rare, replaced by tired smiles and quiet winces when she thought he wasn't looking. The doctors had given her a prescription, but the cost of the medicine was more than they had. Owen had overheard her talking to the pharmacist, her voice strained, her hands gripping the counter as she asked if there was a cheaper option. There wasn't. So here he was, standing at the flea market under the shadow of an old canopy, gripping his toy like it was the most important thing in the world. Because, to him, it was. It had always been. But not anymore. Not when his mom needed that medicine. He had taken his tiny collection of toys and placed them neatly on an old crate, but it was clear what the real treasure was: the car. His mom had told him to stay home while she rested, but Owen had made up his mind. He wasn't going to sit and watch her get worse. People passed by, some barely glancing his way, others giving him a quick smile before moving on. His heart sank with each person that walked past without stopping. He tried calling out, his small voice lost in the chatter of the market. "Toy car for sale! It's really special!" A man with a scruffy beard stopped and looked at the items before shaking his head. "How much for the car, kid?" Owen straightened. $10. The man let out a low whistle. "That's a steep price for a toy car." "It's important," Owen said, his voice serious. "It's my best one." The man hesitated, then sighed. "Sorry, kid. Can't do 10. He walked away, leaving Owen gripping the toy even tighter. Minutes passed. The sun grew hotter. Owen could feel his stomach twisting with worry. What if no one bought it? What if he had to go home empty-handed? The thought made his throat tighten. Then, a shadow fell over him. Owen looked up to see a tall man in a sleek gray suit standing in front of him. He had the kind of presence that made people move out of his way without him saying a word. His dark hair was neatly styled, and he held a cup of coffee in one hand while scrolling through his phone with the other. But something made him pause. Maybe it was the way Owen stood there, determined yet small, or the way his tiny hands clutched the car like it was a lifeline. Whatever it was, the man put his phone away and crouched down to eye level. "What are you selling?" Owen straightened, his heart pounding. "My car." He held it out carefully, almost reverently. The man studied it, his sharp blue eyes flicking between the toy and Owen's face. "How much?" Owen hesitated. Should he lower the price? Would this man walk away like the others? But no, he couldn't. He needed the money. $10, he said firmly. The man raised an eyebrow. "That must be one special car." Owen nodded. "It is. But my mom needs medicine, and we don't have enough money." The words were simple, spoken without self-pity, but they landed heavily in the air between them. The man's expression shifted slightly, something unreadable flickering across his face. He glanced down at the car again, then at Owen, then reached into his jacket pocket. "I'll take it," he said. Owen's breath caught. "Really?" The man nodded, but instead of pulling out his wallet, he took out a slim checkbook. He wrote something down, tore out the check, and handed it to Owen along with the car. "Here." Owen blinked, confused. He had expected a few crumpled bills, maybe a $10 bill if he was lucky. But when he looked down, his breath hitched. $10,000. His fingers trembled as he stared at the number. He wasn't sure he had ever seen that many zeros in one place before. His stomach flipped, and for the first time since coming to the market, he felt the sting of tears press against his eyes. He swallowed hard. This is too much," he whispered. The man's voice was calm but firm. "It's exactly what it's worth." Owen didn't know what to say. He felt like his heart was about to burst out of his chest. "Thank you," he breathed. "Thank you so much." The man gave a small nod. "What's your name, kid?" "Owen." "Well, Owen, you take that check to your mom, okay?" Owen clutched it tightly, as if afraid it would disappear. "I will." The man hesitated for a brief moment before standing up and ruffling Owen's hair lightly. "Take care of her." With that, he turned and walked away, disappearing into the crowd before Owen could even ask his name. Owen didn't waste another second. He grabbed his other toys, stuffed them into his backpack, and ran all the way home, his small legs pumping as fast as they could. When he burst through the apartment door, panting and flushed, Emily sat up from the couch, startled. "Owen! What? Where have you been?" He practically flew into her arms, thrusting the check into her hands. "Mom! We can buy the medicine! We can buy all of it!" Emily took the paper, her brow furrowed in confusion, but when she saw the amount, she gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. "Owen, where did you get this?" "I sold my car," he said simply. Tears welled in her eyes as she pulled him close, holding him so tightly he could barely breathe. "Oh, sweetheart," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "You didn't have to do that." "But I wanted to," he said, his voice muffled against her shoulder. "I just want you to be okay." She pulled back, looking at him with so much love it made his chest ache. "I am okay, Owen. Because I have you." That night, as he lay in bed, he thought about the man at the market. The man who had given him more than just money. He had given him hope. And Owen had a feeling he would see him again. Emily sat at the kitchen table long after Owen had fallen asleep, staring at the check as if it might vanish the moment she blinked. $10,000. It was an impossible number, one that didn't belong in her hands, yet there it was, real and solid between her trembling fingers. She should have been overjoyed, but a nagging doubt settled deep in her chest. Who was this man? Why would a stranger give such an extravagant amount for a toy car? It didn't make sense. Nothing about it did. But then she looked at Owen, his small body curled under the blankets, breathing softly, and she knew she couldn't afford to question a miracle. The next morning, she made the call. The pharmacy confirmed that the prescription was ready, and within hours, for the first time in months, Emily held the medicine in her hands. Relief washed over her in a way she hadn't felt in years. She had spent so long carrying the weight of worry, so long pretending to be strong for Owen, but now, for the first time, she allowed herself to believe things might get better. And they did. The improvement wasn't immediate, but it was steady. Within a week, her energy started returning. The constant ache in her bones dulled, the exhaustion that had once dragged her down like quicksand slowly began to lift. She no longer had to sit down after climbing the stairs, no longer had to mask her pain when Owen reached for her hand. Her laughter returned, real and unforced, filling their small apartment with warmth once more. With her strength returning, so did her determination. She wasn't the kind of person who could accept a gift like this without doing something in return. The first thing she did was call every place she had previously applied to, and this time, with a renewed sense of hope, she secured a job at a small design firm. It wasn't glamorous, and it certainly wasn't high-paying, but it was stable, and stability was more than she had dared to hope for. Owen beamed when she told him. "That's awesome, Mom," he said, his brown eyes shining with pride. "Now we won't have to worry anymore, right?" Emily brushed his hair back and kissed his forehead. "Right, baby." But even as she said it, her thoughts drifted back to the man at the flea market, the one who had made all of this possible. Who was he? Would she ever see him again? James Reeves hadn't been able to get the little boy out of his head. It had started as a simple act of impulse. A child standing in the middle of a flea market, desperately selling a toy car, had caught his attention. But now, days later, he found himself thinking about that moment more than he cared to admit. He hadn't bought the toy for the money. $10,000 was nothing to him, but the boy's sincerity had unsettled something deep inside him. There had been a raw, quiet kind of desperation in the kid's voice, not for himself, but for his mother. It wasn't something James was used to seeing. It wasn't something he had ever experienced. He had grown up in wealth, surrounded by privilege, yet somehow, that little boy had carried more strength than most of the executives James worked with. And now, he found himself wondering if the mother had actually used the money. Had it helped? Was she better? James wasn't the type of man to concern himself with strangers, but for some reason, this was different. So, one evening after work, he told his driver to take a detour. The address on the check had been for verification purposes, nothing more, but he had memorized it without meaning to. It wasn't hard to find the building, a modest apartment complex tucked between the edges of the city. As the car pulled up, he hesitated. He had no real reason to be here. What was he going to do, knock on the door and announce himself? That was ridiculous. Before he could change his mind, movement near the entrance caught his eye. A woman and a small boy were stepping out, the child tugging on her hand, laughing. His laughter was familiar. James recognized the tousled brown hair, the same determination in his eyes. It was him. But it wasn't the boy that made James pause, it was the mother. Emily. She was nothing like he had pictured. When he had imagined her, she had been frail, exhausted, the way Owen had described her. But the woman in front of him was radiant. She still had a slight thinness to her frame, as if she were recovering from something, but there was color in her cheeks, a life in her expression that hadn't been there before. She was beautiful in a way that was effortless, in a way that made something shift in his chest before he could stop it. James wasn't a man who second-guessed himself, but in that moment, he did. He had planned to check in, to satisfy his curiosity. But now, watching her laugh as she knelt to tie Owen's shoe, he suddenly felt like an intruder. And yet, before he could turn away, Owen spotted him. The little boy's eyes widened, and before James could even think, Owen broke into a run, his small legs carrying him across the pavement. "Hey!" he called out, waving his arms. "It's you!" Emily turned at the sound of Owen's voice, her brows furrowing in confusion as she followed his gaze. When she saw James, she froze. For a second, no one moved. Then, James stepped forward, unsure of what he was going to say, but before he could speak, Owen blurted out, "Mom, this is the guy. The one who bought my car." Emily's breath caught. James extended his hand, the corner of his mouth tilting slightly. "James Reeves." Emily hesitated before shaking it, her fingers warm against his. "Emily Harper." There was something in her eyes when she looked at him, something wary yet grateful, and for the first time in a long time, James found himself at a loss for words. Owen, oblivious to the unspoken tension, grinned up at him. "You came to check on us, huh?" James hesitated before nodding. "I guess I did." Emily's lips parted in surprise, and for a moment, he thought she might tell him to leave. But then, slowly, she smiled. "Would you like to come in?" James wasn't sure why he said yes. But as he followed them inside, he had a feeling this was only the beginning. Emily had always been a firm believer in repaying kindness. No matter how hard life got, she had never wanted to owe anyone anything. It was a matter of pride, of dignity, of proving to herself and the world that she could stand on her own 2 feet. And yet here she was, standing outside the towering glass building of Reeves Enterprises, clutching an envelope in her hands, wondering if she was making a mistake. It had been 2 weeks since James Reeves had walked into her life, and in that time, everything had changed. The medicine had done its job, and every day she felt stronger, more like herself. She had started her new job at the design firm, and for the first time in years, she had enough to pay rent without worrying if there'd be anything left for groceries. But no matter how much better things got, one thing lingered in the back of her mind, the $10,000. It was a gift, freely given, but it didn't sit right with her. She hadn't earned it. And she couldn't rest knowing that debt still existed, even if James had never called it that. So, she had done what she always did when faced with something uncomfortable, she confronted it head-on. Taking a deep breath, she stepped through the building's entrance. The air inside was cool and sterile, a stark contrast to the warmth of her small apartment. She walked up to the front desk, feeling painfully out of place in her second-hand blazer and thrift store shoes. The receptionist barely glanced up. "I'm here to see James Reeves," Emily said, trying to keep her voice steady. The woman gave her a skeptical once-over. "Do you have an appointment?" "No," Emily admitted, shifting the envelope in her hands. "But I just need 5 minutes of his time." The receptionist sighed, as if she had heard that request 1,000 times before. "Mr. Reeves doesn't take unscheduled meetings." Before Emily could respond, a familiar voice cut through the air. "It's fine, Angela. Let her through." She turned to see James standing a few feet away, his sharp blue eyes locked onto hers. He was dressed in another expensive suit, exuding the same effortless confidence as the first time they had met. But there was something else now, something softer. Emily swallowed, feeling the weight of his gaze. He tilted his head toward the elevators, a silent invitation, and without a word she followed him. His office was massive, lined with floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked the city skyline. It was the kind of space that made her feel even smaller than she already did, but she refused to let it intimidate her. She placed the envelope on his desk before he could even take a seat. "This is for you," she said firmly. James arched a brow, leaning against the edge of his desk. "And what is this exactly?" Emily lifted her chin. "It's the first installment of what I owe you. It's not much, but I'll keep paying you back, little by little, until the full 10,000 is returned." For a long moment, James said nothing. He simply stared at her, his expression unreadable. Then, with a sigh, he picked up the envelope and, without even opening it, placed it right back in front of her. "No." Emily blinked. "What do you mean, no?" "I mean no," he repeated, crossing his arms. "It wasn't a loan, Emily. You don't have to pay me back." Her jaw tightened. "I do. I can't just take money from someone, especially someone I barely know." James exhaled, shaking his head. "You're not taking anything. I gave it to Owen because he needed it. Because you needed it. That's all there is to it." Emily clenched her fists, frustrated by his easy dismissal of something that felt so significant to her. "I don't want to feel like I owe you, James." He studied her for a moment, then leaned forward slightly. "Then don't," he said quietly. "I didn't do it so you'd feel indebted to me. I did it because your son was willing to give up the one thing he treasured most just to help you. That kind of love is rare, and I respected it." Emily felt her resolve waver. She had been expecting resistance, but not this, not understanding, not warmth. She swallowed hard. "Still, I don't feel right just letting it go." James sighed again, but this time, there was amusement in his expression. "Okay," he said, straightening. "Then let's make a deal." She frowned. "What kind of deal?" "Since you insist on paying me back, let's start small." He grabbed his phone from his desk and tapped a few buttons. "Let me buy you and Owen dinner." Emily blinked. "Dinner?" "Yes," he said easily. "You want to do something in return for me? Then let me take you both out." She opened her mouth to argue, but he held up a hand before she could. "Think of it this way, you're not accepting charity. You're just having dinner with a friend." The word friend threw her off. It felt strange to hear from a man like James Reeves, a man so far removed from her world. And yet, something about the way he said it made it feel real. She hesitated, then nodded. "All right. One dinner." James's lips curved into the faintest smile. One dinner. That evening, Emily and Owen met James at a quiet Italian restaurant, far from the flashy, high-end places she had expected someone like him to frequent. The moment they walked in, Owen's eyes lit up at the sight of the massive wood-fired pizza oven, and Emily couldn't help but laugh as he eagerly told James all about his favorite toppings. James, to her surprise, listened. Not in the polite, distracted way adults often did with kids, but with real interest. By the time the food arrived, Owen was already halfway through telling James about his favorite superheroes, and Emily found herself watching them, something warm settling in her chest. For the first time in what felt like forever, she wasn't worrying about bills or medicine. She wasn't thinking about the weight of responsibility constantly pressing down on her shoulders. She was just there, enjoying the moment. And James, for all his wealth and power, looked just as at ease as she felt. At one point, as Owen focused on his plate, James met her gaze. "You know," he said, "you should let yourself accept kindness once in a while." Emily exhaled a soft laugh. "I'm not used to it." James tilted his head. "Maybe you should be." She wasn't sure how to respond to that, so she didn't. But as the night went on, as she laughed more than she had in years, as Owen leaned sleepily against her shoulder on the drive home, she couldn't shake the feeling that, somehow, this man was becoming something more than just a fleeting act of generosity in their lives. And for the first time in a long time, James hadn't planned on seeing them again so soon. After dinner, he had expected to go back to his usual routine, the endless meetings, the high-stakes deals, the carefully structured life he had built for himself. But something had shifted that night. Maybe it was the way Emily had finally let her guard down, laughing freely over plates of pizza, or the way Owen had practically fallen asleep mid-sentence, completely at ease in James's presence. Or maybe it was the realization that, for the first time in years, James himself had felt at ease too. So, when he found himself driving back to their neighborhood a few days later, he told himself it was just a casual visit. Nothing more. After all, he had technically bought the toy car, he had every right to check in on its previous owner. That was the excuse he used when Emily opened the door, surprised to see him standing there with a small bag in his hand. "I figured Owen might want this back," he said, holding up the bag. Emily frowned. "What is it?" James smirked. "You'll have to ask him." She gave him a look but let him in anyway, calling for Owen. The boy came barreling out of his room, skidding to a stop when he saw James. "You came back?" Owen grinned. "Did you bring snacks?" James chuckled. "Not this time. But I did bring something for you." He handed over the bag, and Owen pulled out the contents, a nearly identical toy car, but this one was brand new, gleaming red and unscuffed. His eyes widened. "Whoa!" He held it up next to his old one, the difference stark. "It looks just like mine, but fancy." James leaned against the couch. "I figured your original car deserved a break after all those years. Now you've got one for special occasions." Owen grinned. "Like rich people have a fancy car they only drive sometimes?" James smirked. "Exactly." Emily, standing nearby, folded her arms. "You didn't have to do that." James shrugged. "I wanted to." And that was the beginning of something neither of them had expected. James started stopping by more often, always under the pretense of something small, bringing Owen a book he thought he'd like, dropping off takeout after a long day, claiming he just happened to be in the neighborhood. He never overstayed, never pushed, but somehow, his presence became natural, familiar. Owen was always thrilled to see him, and Emily. Well, she had stopped looking so wary every time he showed up. One Saturday afternoon, James found himself in the park with them, tossing a baseball back and forth with Owen while Emily sat on a bench, watching with an amused expression. Owen had insisted James needed more practice, after a near miss with a fast throw. "You know," Emily called out, smirking. "For someone who runs an empire, you're not very good at catching." James caught the next ball with ease and tossed it back to Owen. "I delegate. That's what CEOs do." Owen laughed. "That's a fancy way of saying you let other people do the hard work." James raised an eyebrow. "You're smarter than most of my board members." Emily shook her head, but there was laughter in her eyes. After the game, they sat on a picnic blanket, finishing the sandwiches Emily had packed. Owen, full and content, flopped onto his back and stared up at the sky. "This is nice," he murmured, voice sleepy. "It's like having a dad." Silence fell. Emily stiffened, her fingers tightening around the edge of the blanket. James, too, felt something jolt in his chest. But before either of them could say anything, Owen rolled over onto his side, propping himself up on one elbow. "Almost dad," he added, grinning at James. "You're not really my dad, but kinda." Emily groaned, covering her face. "Owen." James, to her horror, didn't look offended in the slightest. In fact, he was laughing, his deep chuckle rumbling through the air. "Almost dad, huh?" he mused. "That's a new one." Owen nodded. "Yeah. You're not as strict as a real dad would be, but you do cool stuff, and you hang out with us. So, almost dad." Emily let out a breath, rubbing her temples. "You can't just go around saying things like that, buddy." "Why not?" Owen looked at her, genuinely confused. "I think Mr. James likes us." James, still amused, glanced at Emily. "He's not wrong." She shot him a look, flustered, but he could see the hint of a smile she was trying to fight. From that day on, Owen's nickname for him stuck. James didn't correct him, didn't push it away, because, truthfully, he didn't mind. If anything, the more time he spent with them, the less he wanted to leave. He had spent years in boardrooms, surrounded by luxury, wealth, and people who only saw him as a business opportunity. But here, in Emily's small apartment, with Owen's toys scattered across the floor and the smell of home-cooked meals filling the air, he felt something he hadn't in a long time. Peace. Emily still hesitated sometimes, still looked at him with guarded eyes when she thought he wasn't paying attention. She wasn't used to people sticking around. James could see that. But she was getting used to him, little by little. One evening, as they cleaned up after dinner, she finally said what had been on her mind. "You don't have to keep doing this, you know." James, drying a plate, glanced at her. "Doing what?" "Showing up. Spending time with us. You're a busy man, James." She met his gaze, searching for something. "Why are you still here?" He set the plate down and leaned against the counter. "Do you want me to stop?" She opened her mouth, then closed it. James tilted his head. "Didn't think so." Emily sighed, rubbing her forehead. "It's just, I don't want Owen getting attached if this is temporary." James studied her for a long moment before answering. "I don't do things I don't want to do, Emily. If I'm here, it's because I want to be." She swallowed, looking away. "That's what scares me." He didn't push. He just let her sit with it. Because no matter how much she tried to keep her walls up, no matter how much she tried to convince herself he was just a passing chapter in their story, he wasn't going anywhere. James Reeves had spent years building a life of control, of certainty. But with Emily and Owen, he was starting to realize that sometimes, the best things weren't planned. And that terrified him more than anything else. James had always been careful. He had spent his life calculating risks, ensuring that he never invested too much of himself into anything that could be taken away. Business was easy, numbers were predictable, people could be controlled with the right incentives. But emotions? Relationships? Those were dangerous. And somehow, without even realizing it, he had let Emily and Owen become a part of his world, slipping past the walls he had built so carefully. For weeks, he had told himself it was nothing. That he was just being kind, that he was only looking out for Owen because he admired the boy's determination. But the truth had been clear the first time he caught himself thinking about Emily long after he had left her apartment. It had been clear when he found himself glancing at his phone, waiting for a message that never came. It had been undeniable when he had started canceling meetings just to spend an extra hour with them, sitting at their tiny kitchen table, listening to Owen talk about superheroes while Emily tucked her hair behind her ear and smiled. And that was the problem. He had loved once before. He had trusted before. And he had been left shattered. James told himself he wouldn't let it happen again. So he pulled away. It started subtly, small excuses, an unexpected work trip, a late-night meeting that kept him from joining them for dinner. Emily didn't question it at first, But James saw the flicker of doubt in her eyes when he cancelled their plans at the last minute. He heard the hesitation in her voice when he called to reschedule. And yet he didn't stop. Because if he let himself get any closer, he wouldn't survive it when she left. Emily noticed the shift, even if James thought she wouldn't. She had learned to recognize the signs of someone pulling away, had lived through it too many times before. Her entire life had been built around people leaving. Her father, who had walked out before she was old enough to remember, the man who had given her Owen but had never been a father, the friends who had disappeared when things got too hard. She had learned not to expect people to stay. But James had been different. He had made her believe, just for a moment, that maybe she wasn't alone. That maybe, for once, someone saw her, not as a burden, not as a woman struggling to keep her life together, but as someone worth showing up for. And now, he was slipping away, just like everyone else. She didn't ask him about it. She didn't chase after him. If there was one thing she refused to do, it was beg someone to stay. So she pulled back too. Dinners turned into short conversations. The easy laughter they had once shared became guarded pleasantries. And then, one evening, James cancelled their plans without even offering to reschedule. Emily took that as the answer she had been dreading. Owen noticed before she even had to say anything. He was young, but he was sharp, and he had always been able to read her in a way that made her both proud and heartbroken. "Did I do something wrong?" he asked quietly one night as she tucked him into bed. Emily's heart clenched. "Of course not, baby. Then why isn't James coming around anymore?" She forced a smile, smoothing his hair. "He's busy. He has a lot of important things to do." Owen frowned. "I thought we were important to him." Emily swallowed the lump in her throat. "Me too." Owen didn't say anything else, but the next afternoon, when school let out, he had a plan. James hadn't expected to see Owen standing outside his office building. He had just wrapped up a meeting, stepping out of the sleek glass doors when he spotted the boy sitting on a bench near the entrance, legs swinging. His heart dropped. "Owen?" The boy looked up and grinned, but there was something behind it, something almost disappointed. James felt his stomach twist. "You busy?" Owen asked. James ran a hand through his hair. No. But Owen, how did you get here?" "Bus," Owen said matter-of-factly. "Mom doesn't know. She'd freak out." James exhaled sharply. "Yeah, I imagine she would." He crouched in front of Owen, trying to keep his voice even. "You can't just go places by yourself, buddy. It's not safe." Owen shrugged, swinging his legs. "I needed to ask you something." James hesitated. "Okay. What is it?" Owen tilted his head, studying him in a way that was far too observant for a child his age. "Why are you making my mom sad?" James felt the question like a punch to the ribs. He opened his mouth, then closed it. "I'm not, you are," Owen said, cutting him off. "She won't say it, but I can tell. She's been quiet. She smiles, but not the real kind. It's the fake one she does when she doesn't want me to worry." James exhaled, rubbing the back of his neck. "Owen, you like her, don't you?" Owen asked, his tone so blunt James nearly laughed. He let out a slow breath. "It's complicated." Owen's brow furrowed. "Why?" James stared at him, not knowing how to explain years of heartbreak, of betrayal, of the fear that came with caring too much. But looking at Owen, so open, so trusting, he realized that he couldn't lie to him. "Because sometimes, when you care about someone too much, it hurts," James said quietly. "And I don't want to hurt your mom. Or you." Owen tilted his head. "But you're hurting her by leaving." James sucked in a breath. Owen let out a sigh, sounding far too old for his age. "Look, I don't know a lot about grown-up stuff, but I know that when people like each other, they're supposed to stick around. And if you're scared, that's dumb, because my mom's the best person ever. She's never hurt anyone. And if you make her happy, and she makes you happy, why would you stop coming over?" James had no answer. Owen hopped off the bench, standing in front of him. I should probably get home before she finds out I was here. But you should fix it." James watched as the boy walked away, the weight of his words pressing down on him like a stone. He had spent his entire life believing that distance was the only way to protect himself. That if he never let himself get too close, he could never be hurt again. But Owen was right. He was hurting Emily. And he was hurting himself. For the first time in a long time, James realized he was scared. But maybe, just maybe, it was time to stop running. James spent the night pacing his penthouse, staring out at the city skyline, trying to untangle the mess in his head. Owen's words played on a loop in his mind, refusing to fade. "You're hurting her by leaving." The boy had been right. He had spent his entire life running from the idea of love, of attachment, of anything that could make him vulnerable. And now, for the first time, he wasn't sure if he had the strength to run anymore. Because this time, walking away hadn't made him feel safe. It had made him feel empty. He thought of Emily, her quiet resilience, the way she carried the weight of the world on her shoulders without complaint. He thought of the way she smiled when she thought no one was looking, the soft way she spoke to Owen when she tucked him in at night. He thought of how she had never once asked for anything from him, not even after he had changed her life with a single check. She wasn't like anyone he had ever known. She wasn't impressed by his wealth, wasn't interested in his power. She had only ever wanted one thing, for the people she loved to be okay. And James knew, with a clarity that terrified him, that he loved her. The realization hit him hard, left him breathless. He hadn't let himself believe it before, but it had been there all along, slowly building, waiting for him to be brave enough to acknowledge it. And now, standing there in his cold, perfect apartment, he understood something else, too. If he didn't do something, if he didn't fight for this, he would regret it for the rest of his life. So he made a call. By the time morning came, he was standing outside a high-end collector's showroom, waiting for the doors to open. The man who owned the collection specialized in rare items, things most people wouldn't look at twice but that collectors paid small fortunes to own. James had heard about him through one of his business acquaintances, had been told he had an eye for sentimentality. And that was exactly what James was looking for. The toy car was displayed behind glass, framed like a piece of art. It was nearly identical to Owen's, the same make, the same model, just in perfect condition. It had been manufactured decades ago, part of a limited run that had made it valuable among enthusiasts. But James didn't care about its worth, he cared about what it represented. The collector had named his price. James didn't flinch. When he left, the car was in his hands. Emily hadn't expected to see James again. Not after the way he had pulled away, not after the way she had forced herself to accept that whatever they had been building had slipped through her fingers. She had tried not to be bitter about it. He had been kind to her, to Owen. He had changed their lives in ways she could never fully explain. But in the end, he had still walked away. And she had told herself she wouldn't waste time grieving something that was never truly hers to begin with. So when there was a knock at the door that evening, she opened it without expecting anything. And then she froze. James stood there, looking like a man on the edge of something irreversible. His suit was slightly rumpled, as if he had been running his hands through his hair. His expression was unreadable, intense, searching, vulnerable. In his hands he held a small, carefully wrapped box. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Then, quietly, James said, "Can I come in?" Emily swallowed hard, her heart pounding. Then, against her better judgment, she stepped aside. Owen, hearing the movement, came running in from the other room. The moment he saw James, his face lit up. "You came back!" James gave him a small smile. "Yeah, buddy. I did." He crouched down, holding out the box. "I brought you something." Owen's eyes widened as he took it, peeling back the wrapping with the kind of excitement only a child could have. When the toy car appeared in his hands, his mouth fell open. "No way," he breathed. "It's just like mine." James nodded. "I found it in a collector's shop. Thought you might want it." Owen turned the car over in his hands, then looked up at James, his expression serious. But why? James hesitated, glancing at Emily before answering. Because some things are worth holding on to. Something shifted in the air. Emily felt it like a weight pressing against her chest, something too big to ignore. She wasn't sure if it was the way James was looking at her, or the way her heart was hammering so loudly she could barely think. Owen, still staring at the toy, grinned suddenly. This is the best thing ever. I'm gonna put it next to my other one. He turned and ran off toward his room, leaving the two adults standing there in heavy silence. James exhaled, rubbing the back of his neck. I don't know how to do this, he admitted finally. I don't know how to be the person who stays. Emily's throat tightened. Then why are you here? He looked at her, really looked at her, and for the first time, there was no hesitation in his expression. Because I can't walk away from you, he said quietly. From Owen. From this. He took a step closer, his voice low but steady. I tried, Emily. I told myself I couldn't do this, that I didn't deserve to. But being away from you felt worse than any risk I've ever taken. And I know I don't have the best track record with trust, but I swear to you, I'm not running anymore. Emily's eyes burned. She wanted to believe him. Wanted to let herself believe that this time, things could be different. But the fear still lingered, the doubt, the voice in her head that had always warned her against getting too close. James must have seen it, because he reached out, gently taking her hands in his. I don't just care about you, Emily, he said. I need you. I need this. And if you tell me you don't feel the same, if you tell me to walk away right now, I will. But if there's even a part of you that wants me to stay, I swear, I will spend every day proving to you that I'm not going anywhere. Emily let out a shaky breath. And then, without thinking, without planning, without overanalyzing, she stepped forward and pressed her lips to his. James inhaled sharply, startled, but then his hands were on her waist, pulling her closer, deepening the kiss like he had been waiting for this moment forever. When they finally pulled apart, he rested his forehead against hers, exhaling a soft laugh. So I'm guessing that means you want me to stay? Emily smiled, and for the first time in a long time, it felt real. Yeah, she whispered. I do. Emily had always believed love should be simple. She had imagined something quiet and steady, something that felt like home. But nothing about being with James was simple. It was intense, overwhelming, and sometimes terrifying, but it was real. And after years of struggling alone, she had finally allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, she didn't have to do it alone anymore. James had stayed. True to his word, he hadn't pulled away again. He had been there every morning with coffee in hand, every evening with stories about his day, every weekend finding some excuse to take Owen out for an adventure. They had fallen into something resembling a routine, something warm and comfortable, something Emily had never dared to want. But comfort was a fragile thing, and it didn't take long before reality came crashing in. It started small, strangers staring a little too long when they were out together, whispers in the background of restaurants, a few curious glances when James picked Owen up from school. But then the headlines came. Emily had never thought of herself as someone the world would care about. She was just a single mom, working hard to give her son a decent life. But the moment a photographer caught a candid shot of her and James walking out of a bookstore, fingers loosely intertwined, everything changed. Billionaire James Reeves spotted with mystery woman, romance or fling? From struggling single mom to billionaire's girlfriend, who is Emily Harper? James Reeves's new love interest, is she after his fortune? Emily had never paid much attention to tabloids before, but now, she couldn't escape them. Her face was plastered across gossip websites, speculation running wild about who she was, what she wanted, why someone like James would be with someone like her. She told herself not to care. She told herself that the opinions of strangers didn't matter. But it was impossible to ignore the way people stared, the way whispers followed her wherever she went, the way the mothers at Owen's school started looking at her differently, like she was something to be studied, dissected, judged. And worst of all, she started wondering if maybe they were right. James noticed almost immediately. One evening, after dinner, as they sat together in her living room, Emily scrolling mindlessly through her phone, he reached over and gently took it from her hands. She looked up at him, startled. "Stop reading that garbage," he said softly. Emily exhaled, leaning back against the couch. "I'm trying." He studied her, something unreadable in his expression. "But—" she hesitated. "But maybe they're right." His brows furrowed. "About what?" She bit her lip, looking away. "About us. About how we don't make sense." James's jaw tightened. "Emily, I mean, look at us, James," she interrupted. "You're you? And I'm just—" She let out a dry laugh, shaking her head. "I'm just a woman who was selling her kid's toy car at a flea market." James stared at her for a long moment before setting his glass down with deliberate care. "Don't do that." "Do what?" "Talk like you're not enough." His voice was firm but gentle, the kind of tone that left no room for argument. "You act like I'm doing you some kind of favor by being with you, but do you even realize how much you've given me?" Emily blinked, caught off guard. James leaned closer, his gaze intense. "Before you, my life was predictable. Structured. Controlled. I thought that was what I wanted. And then you and Owen crashed into it like a hurricane, and suddenly, nothing made sense anymore. But for the first time, I liked that. I liked not knowing what came next. I liked coming home to something that actually felt like home." Emily swallowed hard. "You are not just some woman I happened to meet, Emily," he continued. "You are the best damn thing that's ever happened to me. And I don't care what some reporters or bored housewives on the internet have to say about it." She let out a shaky breath. "But I don't belong in your world, James." His lips curved slightly. "Then maybe it's time I leave my world and stay in yours." She let out a breathless laugh, shaking her head. "You're impossible." "I'm serious." He reached for her hand, threading his fingers through hers. "I don't care about the money. I don't care about the press. I care about us. About you. About Owen. And I'm not going anywhere." And somehow, that was enough. The media storm didn't stop, but it became easier to ignore. James shielded her from the worst of it, his team making sure that nothing crossed the line into harassment. The whispers didn't matter as much when she realized that, for the first time, she had someone standing beside her, ready to fight for what they had. Then, one afternoon, everything changed again. Emily had just picked Owen up from school when a reporter, one bolder than the rest, approached, microphone in hand. Emily tensed, ready to brush past, but before she could say anything, Owen spoke up. "You know Mr. James is already part of our family, right?" The reporter blinked. "Oh?" Owen nodded solemnly, as if it was the most obvious thing in the world. "Yeah. He loves my mom, and I think that means he loves me, too. So he's kinda like my almost dad. But I think he's gonna be my real dad one day." Emily's breath caught in her throat. The reporter, clearly delighted by the unexpected moment, chuckled. "Is that so?" Owen beamed. "Yup." The clip went viral within hours. "James Reeves already a father figure? Young boys' words melt hearts everywhere. Single mom and billionaire, more than just a fling?" But this time, the headlines didn't bother Emily. Because for the first time, they had gotten something right. James wasn't just someone passing through their lives. He was already family. The world had changed so much in just a few short months. The whispers had faded into background noise, the scrutiny of their relationship becoming just another passing story in the media cycle. What had once felt overwhelming and impossible now felt normal. James coming over for dinner, Owen rushing to him the moment he walked through the door, Emily no longer hesitating before reaching for his hand. She had spent so long believing that love wasn't meant for her, that it was something fleeting, something other people got to keep while she was left with only the pieces. But James had stayed. No matter how much she had doubted, no matter how many times she had tried to convince herself that this was all temporary, he had never once given her a reason to believe he was going anywhere. And now, as she sat beside him in his car, watching the familiar streets pass by, she realized that she had never been more at peace. "Where are we going?" she asked, glancing over at him. James smirked, keeping his eyes on the road. "You'll see." Owen, buckled into the back seat, was practically bouncing with excitement. "I know, but I'm not supposed to tell you," he said with a grin. Emily raised a brow. "Oh? So you're keeping secrets from me now?" Owen gasped dramatically. "Mr. James made me promise. It's a surprise." Emily shook her head, amused, but she didn't press. She trusted James. She trusted him in a way she had never trusted anyone before, and that realization was still something she was getting used to. When James finally pulled into the parking lot, Emily's breath caught in her throat. The flea market. The place where it had all begun, where Owen had stood with his tiny toy car and his determined heart, unknowingly setting everything in motion. She turned to James, her heart pounding. "Why are we here?" Instead of answering, he got out of the car. Owen scrambled out right after him, barely containing his excitement. Emily followed, a knot of anticipation curling in her stomach as James took her hand and led her toward the same spot where she and Owen had once stood, desperate and hopeful all at once. And then, from his pocket, James pulled out something small. A toy car. Emily's breath hitched. It was the car, Owen's old, chipped, beloved toy, the one he had sold that day without hesitation, the one that had changed everything. She looked up at James, tears already pricking her eyes. "How did you?" "I tracked it down," James said softly. "It took a while. Turns out, it passed through a couple of hands before I found it." He turned the car over in his palm, his fingers brushing the faded paint. "But I had to get it back. Because this car, it started everything. It led me to you." Emily swallowed hard, her throat tight with emotion. "James!" Slowly, he knelt down on one knee, still holding the toy car in his hands. Owen let out a loud gasp. "It's happening!" Emily laughed through the tears welling in her eyes, pressing a hand to her mouth. James smiled up at her, his expression full of a love so deep it made her chest ache. He popped open the top of the toy car, revealing something hidden inside, a ring. Not flashy. Not overwhelming. Simple and elegant, just like her. "I've spent my whole life thinking love was something I had to keep at a distance," James said, his voice steady but thick with emotion. "That if I let myself care too much, I'd end up with nothing. And then you and Owen came along and turned my world upside down. And suddenly, I didn't want to be distant anymore. I wanted to be here. With you. Always." Emily's vision blurred as a tear slipped down her cheek. James took a breath. "I love you, Emily Harper. I love your strength, your kindness, your stubbornness. I love the way you've never asked for anything but have given me everything. And I love Owen more than I ever thought possible." He looked at the boy, then back at her. "So if you'll have me, I want to be part of this family. For real. Forever." Owen was practically vibrating with excitement. "Say yes, Mom! Please!" Emily let out a shaky laugh, looking between James, the ring, and the boy who had unknowingly brought them all together. And in that moment, she knew there was no hesitation left in her heart. "Yes," she whispered, then louder, as she dropped to her knees and threw her arms around James. "Yes, yes, yes." James exhaled a breath of relief, holding her close as the weight of everything, the uncertainty, the fear, the years of loneliness, melted away. Owen cheered, jumping up and down. "Mr. James is officially my dad now." James laughed, pulling Emily back just enough to slide the ring onto her finger. "You okay with that, buddy?" Owen grinned, nodding so hard his curls bounced. "Yeah. But can I still call you almost Dad sometimes?" James smirked. "You can call me whatever you want." Owen threw himself at them, hugging them both so tightly that Emily let out a breathless laugh, wrapping her arms around her son and the man who had somehow become her home. And just like that, the life she had never dared to dream of was hers. A love she never thought she'd find. A family she never thought she'd have. And all because of a little boy, a toy car, and the man who had been brave enough to love them both. The days that followed were filled with celebration, laughter, and a kind of warmth Emily had never thought she'd experience. Owen, unable to contain his excitement, told everyone about the proposal, his teachers, the cashier at the grocery store, even the mailman. James took it all in stride, ruffling Owen's hair every time he proudly declared, "My almost dad is my real dad now." The wedding was small, just close friends and a few of James's more trusted colleagues, but it was perfect. Owen stood proudly beside them, grinning ear to ear as they exchanged vows. When James knelt down after kissing Emily, looking Owen in the eye and promising to love him like his own, Emily knew there wasn't a single doubt left in her heart. Their life wasn't extravagant. They didn't live in a mansion, and Emily still insisted on keeping her job even though James had made it clear she didn't have to. But that was the beauty of it. It wasn't about money, or status, or what the world thought. It was about the little moments. Saturday morning pancakes, late-night movies on the couch, the way James still showed up at Owen's school pickup just because he wanted to be there. Love had found her in the most unexpected way, but it had been real, and strong, and worth every bit of uncertainty and fear. And as Emily sat in their living room one evening, watching James and Owen race their toy cars across the coffee table, she realized something. This was home. This was everything. And she wouldn't change a single thing. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to leave a like, it really helps out the channel. And if you want more heartwarming and emotional stories like this, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Let me know in the comments what you thought of this one. I'd love to hear your reactions. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next story.